but I will also make a nation of the son of this slave woman, because he is your offspring." Genesis chapter 21, verse 13. This verse has been in the Bible for over 3,000 years and is almost never preached. It's hidden in the middle of a chapter that everyone reads thinking about something else, and it single-handedly dismantles the version of history that most people have learned. Because the version most people have learned goes something like this: Abraham and Sarah grew impatient, decided to help God, and from this mistake, Ishmael was born. Isaac would be the son of the promise, the son of faith. Ishmael would be the son of the flesh, the son of error, the problem that God had to manage. One is good, the other is the remainder. But the Hebrew text never says that. Nowhere in Genesis does God reject Ishmael. God separates his inheritance. God removes him from the covenant line of the land. But God speaks to his mother twice, names him before his birth, promises to multiply his descendants, saves his life in the desert, stays with him while he grows up, and in the end gives him exactly what he had promised: 12 princes and a territory stretching from one end of Arabia to the other. A cursed child does not receive this. So this story will be retold from the beginning, without shortcuts. Only Genesis chapter 16, chapter 17, chapter 21, and chapter 25. With the original Hebrew, because in 3 or 4 crucial points, the Portuguese translation erases the meaning. With the law of the time, because half of what happens in this story is legal procedure from the second millennium BC, and without it, the scenes seem like pettiness, which they are not. With the real geography, because the desert where this boy grew up exists, has a name, has coordinates, and can be seen by satellite today, and with what history outside the Bible has preserved about what happened afterward. The story begins before his birth. It begins in a tent in Canaan, with an Egyptian woman who had a name, a position, and a destiny that no one there imagined. Abram is 85 years old. He has lived in Canaan for 10 years. 10 years since God commanded him to leave Haran and promised to make him a great nation. 10 years of tents, flocks, a well dug, and an altar built. 10 years of hearing the same promise repeated in visions. His descendants would be as numerous as the dust of the earth and as many as the stars in the sky. And 10 years without a single pregnancy. Sarai is 75 years old. She is barren. The text of Genesis opens chapter 16 precisely there, without beating around the bush. Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And here we have the first word that the Portuguese translation hides. The Hebrew word used to describe Hagar in this verse is shifcha. Portuguese translates it as servant, and that's it. However, Hebrew has 2 different words for this, and they don't mean the same thing. One of them is amma. Amma is the purchased slave, the laborer, the woman who works at the base of the tent and has no status within the house. The other is shifcha. Shifcha is the personal servant of a woman of position. She is the lady-in-waiting. She is the one who walks with the mistress, who sleeps near her, who answers only to her, who in many cases was treated almost like an adopted daughter, and who had recognized legal status within the family. Hagar is no ordinary slave in the camp. The text makes a point of saying that she is shifcha, a term used to describe a certain type of slave. And it makes a point of saying that she is Egyptian. This raises a question that the text doesn't answer. How did an Egyptian woman end up in the tent of a Hebrew nomad in the middle of Canaan? Ancient Jewish tradition, preserved in the Midrash, has an answer. It links Hagar to the episode in Genesis chapter 12. when Abram goes down to Egypt because of famine and Sarai is taken to Pharaoh's house. When Pharaoh discovers who she is and sees the plagues that fall upon his house, he returns Sarai and even showers her with gifts. Tradition says that one of these gifts was Pharaoh's own daughter, given as a personal servant, because Pharaoh supposedly concluded that it was better for his daughter to be a servant of a woman protected by that god than a princess in his palace. This is tradition, not biblical text, and needs to be treated as such. But the Bible confirms two independent points. Abram left Egypt with male and female servants, and Hagar was Egyptian. What the text makes clear on its own is that this woman had a place, and what comes after only makes sense if she had a place. Sarai approaches her husband with a proposal. She says that the Lord has prevented her from having children and asks Abram to take her servant, because perhaps in this way she will be edified. This expression, "perhaps I will be built up," comes from the Hebrew verb ibaneh, which has the same root as the word for house, bayit. To be built up means to be constructed like a house, to gain descendants, to have a name that continues. Sarai is not talking about feelings. She is talking about lineage. And she's not making anything up. She's applying the law of the time. In the tablets found in the city of Nuzi, in northern Mesopotamia, written around the 15th century BC, but reflecting much older customs, there are marriage contracts with a specific clause. If the wife does not bear a son within a certain period, she herself must provide her husband with a servant to bear an heir. And the son born of this servant is registered as the wife's son. The Code of Hammurabi from Babylon from the 18th century BC deals with the same situation in several paragraphs. The practice had a name, a rule, and a foreseen legal consequence. In other words, what many people interpret as adultery or as a lack of faith was a legally recognized instrument throughout the ancient Middle East for resolving infertility in families of high standing. The womb belonged to the servant, the child belonged to the mistress, and it was the mistress who took the initiative, never the husband alone. Abram hears Sarai's voice. And it's worth noting that the text uses exactly this expression, heard Sarai's voice, the same construction used in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam hears Eve's voice. The Hebrew narrator is not applauding, he is marking something. Hagar becomes pregnant. And the moment she becomes pregnant, the tent floor collapses. The text says that the woman became despised in her eyes. The verb is kalal, which literally means to make light, to diminish in weight, to lose value. Within a culture where a woman's worth was tied to her ability to bear children, what happened there was a complete inversion. The barren woman was the mistress. The fertile woman was the servant. And suddenly, the fertile woman looks at the mistress, and the mistress becomes light. Sarai complains to Abram and blames him. Abram responds in the most uncomfortable way possible. The servant is in her hands. Let her do what is best in her eyes. He withdraws from the decision. And then comes the most serious verb in the chapter. The text says that Sarai afflicted Hagar. The Hebrew verb is anah. This same verb appears again in Exodus chapter 1 to describe what the Egyptians did to the Hebrews in slavery. It is oppression. It is systematic mistreatment. The narrator deliberately chose the word he would later use for slavery in Egypt, and used it to describe what a Hebrew woman did to an Egyptian woman. And Hagar runs away. She flees, pregnant and alone, to the south. And the text gives the direction with map-like precision. She is found near a water source in the desert, at the source that lies on the way to Sur. The road to Shur is the road that connected Canaan to Egypt along the coast and through northern Sinai. Hagar isn't fleeing anywhere. She's going home, She's taking the road back to Egypt, alone, pregnant, crossing a desert that kills experienced people. And it is there, at a spring in the middle of nowhere, that something happens that doesn't happen to anyone else in the book of Genesis. The angel of the Lord finds her. The text uses the expression Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord. And throughout the Old Testament, this figure appears speaking in the first person as if it were God himself, receiving worship, being treated as God by those who encounter it. It is not an ordinary messenger, and the first thing he does is call this woman by name, Hagar, Sarai's servant. He asks where she comes from and where she's going. It's not a lack of information. It's a question that forces the person to look at their own situation. She only answers the first half. She says she's running away from her mistress. She doesn't answer where she was going, perhaps because she herself didn't know. The order that follows is harsh. He commands her to return and submit to the lady's hands. The same verb, ana, appears again, now in the reflexive form. Return and humble yourself. A pregnant woman who has been abused is sent back into the home of her abuser. No explanation is given, no promise that the treatment will change. But along with the command comes something else. It comes a promise that, up to that point in the Bible, had only been made to one man, Abraham. The angel says that he will multiply her descendants in such a way that they will be impossible to count. This is the same language as the promise made to Abram in Genesis chapter 15, and it is being spoken to a runaway Egyptian servant girl in the middle of the desert, beside a spring. It is the only time in the entire Hebrew Bible that a woman directly receives a promise of countless descendants. Then comes the announcement of the birth. She will have a son, and his name has already been chosen, Ishmael, because the Lord heard her affliction. Ishmael, in Hebrew, is Yishmael, two parts. Yishma comes from the verb shama, to hear. El is God. God hears. God heard. Pay attention to who chose this name, because it's almost never mentioned. It wasn't Abraham. It wasn't Sarai. It wasn't Hagar. It was God before the boy was born. Ishmael is the only son in the entire book of Genesis whose name is given directly by God before birth. Isaac's name also comes from God, but it comes later, in Genesis chapter 17, when the promise is renewed. The first divine name given before birth in the book of Genesis is that of the servant's son, and the boy carries in his name, for the rest of his life, an entire phrase, God heard. Then comes verse 12, which is probably the most poorly translated verse in the entire chapter. In Portuguese, almost all versions say some variation of, "He will be as manly as a wild donkey." And the Brazilian ear hears this as an insult. It hears it as if God were saying that the boy was going to be a brute, a stubborn person, a troublemaker. The Hebrew word is pere Adam, and pere is not the pack donkey we are familiar with. Pere is the onager, the wild ass of the desert, a specific animal that still exists today in the Middle East. The book of Job describes this animal in detail in chapter 39. It says that God released the wild donkey, that he gave it the salty desert as its home, that it laughs at the tumult of the city and does not listen to the cries of its driver, that it seeks the green in the mountains and lives free. It's not an insult. It's a definition of nature. God is saying that that boy will not be domesticated. He will not be confined to the city, the palace, the empire, any empire. He will live where others cannot live. He will be free in the desert, just as the onager is free in the desert. The following phrase confirms this: his hand against all, and the hand of all against him. In Hebrew, this type of construction describes total independence. Someone who does not enter into a vassalage alliance with anyone, who does not pay tribute, who owes obedience to any king. A people who do not kneel. And the last part concludes, he will dwell before the face of all his brothers. The word there is panim, face, presence, front. He will not disappear. He will not be erased from the map. He will live right in front, in sight, to the side, forever. Written in Genesis chapter 16 about a boy who hadn't even been born yet. And then Hagar does something that none of the patriarchs in the Bible did. She gives God a name. Abraham built altars. Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. But naming God based on personal experience, that's something this woman does first in the Bible. She calls the Lord who spoke to her El Roi, the God who sees me. And the phrase she utters next is one of the most moving in the Old Testament and one of the most difficult to translate. The meaning is something like this. Could it be that here, in this place, I truly looked upon the one who looks upon me and continued to live? A foreign servant, oppressed, pregnant, fleeing down a desert road, is the one who looks God in the eye and goes forth to tell him. The well where this happened was named after it. It became known as Bir Lahai Roi, which roughly translates to the well of the living one who sees me. The text says it is located between Kadesh and Bered, in the Negev region, and this same well reappears twice in the book of Genesis, always linked to Isaac, who lived near it. A well named after an Egyptian woman became the address of Sarah's son. Hagar returns, and when Abram is 86 years old, she gives birth. And the father gives the boy exactly the name the angel commanded, Ishmael. Now comes a part of the story that many people skip, and which is crucial to understanding everything that happens afterward. 13 years pass between the end of chapter 16 and the beginning of chapter 17. During those 13 years, Ishmael was an only child. He was the heir. He was Abraham's descendant. There was no other. Every promise that God made about seed, about people, about the stars of the sky, Abraham looked at that boy and saw it being fulfilled. Ishmael grew up being treated as the future of that house, and he grew up knowing it. At the age of 99, Abram appears again. He changes his name to Abraham, father of a multitude. He changes Sarai's name to Sarah. He institutes circumcision as a sign of the covenant, and he announces that Sarah will have a son. Abraham falls face down on the ground and laughs, and then he makes a request that reveals his whole heart. He asks that Ishmael live before the face of God. It's a short request, and it's a father's request. After 13 years of raising that boy, teaching him, protecting him, planning for his future, Abraham is asking that this son continue to be the chosen one. That's enough. God answers on two fronts. He says that Sarah will truly have Isaac, and that the covenant will be established with Isaac. But before closing the matter, he says something about Ishmael that needs to be read carefully. God says that he has heard about Ishmael, and that he has blessed him, that he will make him fruitful, that he will multiply him exceedingly, that 12 princes will be born from him, and that he will make him a great nation. 12 princes. This is in Genesis chapter 17, verse 20. Long before Jacob had 12 sons, before anything resembling the 12 tribes of Israel existed, God had already announced 12 leaders descending from Ishmael. And in Genesis chapter 25, the list will appear, name by name. And the chapter ends with a silent scene. On the same day that the covenant of circumcision is instituted, Abraham circumcises himself at 99 years old and circumcises his son Ishmael at 13 years old. The first circumcised in Abraham's lineage, after Abraham himself, is Ishmael. He bears the mark of the covenant on his body, even though he is not its heir. It's worth pausing here for a minute and explaining something about the text we're reading, because it changes the way we study the Bible for the rest of our lives. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and ancient Hebrew was written almost exclusively with consonants. The vowels that we read today were added centuries later by a group of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes, who placed signs above and below the letters to preserve the pronunciation that had been passed down orally. Furthermore, Biblical Hebrew has a small vocabulary compared to Portuguese. Many Hebrew words carry 3 or 4 meanings at the same time, and the context determines which one is valid. When the translator translates this into Portuguese, they are forced to choose one, and the one they didn't choose disappears from the page. That's why Shifcha and Amma reach us as the same word, servant, one indicating position within the family and the other not. That's why Pere Adam becomes an insult in Portuguese, when in the original, it's a description of freedom. The translation isn't lying, it's squeezing a broad meaning into a narrow word. None of this means that a person needs to know Hebrew to understand the Bible. The central message is there, clear, in any serious version. But it does mean that it's worthwhile from time to time to open a second translation, look at a footnote, and compare. Where 2 versions choose different words, there's almost always something good hidden underneath. And in the story of Ishmael, the original text contains at least 5 of these things. 3 have already appeared. The other 2 are coming now. Chapter 21 of Genesis opens with the promise being fulfilled. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said. She conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the appointed time. Abraham was 100 years old. Sarah was 90. The boy is named Isaac, in Hebrew Yitzchak, which comes from the verb sachak, to laugh. His name literally means he laughs, or he will laugh, because they both laughed when they heard the promise. Keep this root in mind, because it returns shortly and becomes the central theme of the entire chapter. Sarah declares that God made her laugh, and that everyone who hears this will laugh along with her. Ishmael is there. He is around 14 years old when his brother is born. Then the text jumps forward 2 or 3 years and goes straight to a party. And here comes the second cultural detail that decides the story. The text says that the boy grew up and was weaned, and that Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. In the ancient Middle East, weaning didn't happen at 1 year old. It happened around 2 to 3 years of age, and in some cases later. And it wasn't a mere domestic detail. Infant mortality in that world was brutal. A huge percentage of children didn't survive their first few years. Weaning was the moment when the family finally breathed a sigh of relief and concluded that this child was here to stay. Mishte Gadol, the great feast, was held. The entire camp gathered, the allies, the chiefs of neighboring clans. And there, in front of witnesses, the father publicly recognized his son and his position within the house. It was a celebration, and it was a legal act at the same time. Translating into modern language, on that day, in front of everyone, Abraham officially presented his heir. And the heir presented was 2 or 3 years old. Outside that circle was a boy of 16 or 17 who had been Abraham's only son for 13 years. What happens next fits into one line. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, the one she had borne to Abraham, and he was doing something that the text describes with a single word. The word is Metzahek, and Metzahek comes from the exact same root as the name Isaac, Sachak, rear. That's why translators have argued for centuries about this verse. Some versions render it as joking, others render it as mocking, others render it as scorning. The intensive form of the verb, which is the one used here, generally carries a stronger meaning than simply finding something funny. It appears elsewhere in the Old Testament with the meaning of mocking, ridiculing, or treating someone as a joke. And the Apostle Paul, writing in Greek more than 1,500 years later, sums up what Ishmael did that day with a single verb: persecuted. The text doesn't say he hit the baby. It doesn't say he threatened anyone. The Hebrew narrator is deliberately economical with words. He delivers the sentence and leaves the reader to settle in. But the context explains a lot. On the day the 2-year-old youngest son is declared heir in front of the entire camp, the 17-year-old eldest, who has occupied that position alone for more than a decade, makes a joke about his brother's name. Isaac means he laughs, and the older brother is laughing. It's the laughter of someone who has been dethroned. And look, this is one of the most debated points in this entire chapter. There are serious scholars who argue that Ishmael was just playing with his little brother, and that Sarah exaggerated. There are equally serious scholars who interpret it as mockery and a threat to succession. Both sides use the same Hebrew and arrive at different conclusions. Write in the comments which side you're on, because I read the comments and use the best ones in future videos. And if you want to follow this kind of reading, word for word, subscribe to the channel. Because the second part of this study, with the map of the 12 Ishmaelite tribes, will be released right here. Sarah sees this, and her reaction is not to yell at the boy. Her reaction is to go to Abraham and use language that anyone in that world would immediately recognize as courtroom language. She orders that servant and her son to be thrown out because that servant's son will not inherit along with Isaac, her son. Two things in that sentence. First, the word translated as cast out is geresh. This verb does not mean send away. Geresh is a technical term. It is the verb used in the Old Testament for formal expulsion, for divorce, for expelling someone from a rightful place. It is the verb used when man is expelled from Eden. It is the verb used in laws concerning divorced women. Sarah is not asking the two to leave the house. She is demanding a legal act of separation. Second, notice how Sarah refers to the people. She doesn't say Hagar. She doesn't say Ishmael. She says this servant and the son of this servant. She is undoing in language the adoption. She is undoing the arrangement of chapter 16, the one in which the son of the Shifcha would be counted as the mistress's son. She is returning the boy to the status of the servant's son, and nothing more. Why would she go to that lengths? Because the law at the time left the door open. The Code of Hammurabi deals precisely with this situation. In paragraph 170, the text states that if a man had children with his wife and also children with a female servant, and if during his life he publicly acknowledged the children of the female servant as his own, then, in the division of the inheritance, the children of the female servant are included, along with the children of the wife, and the firstborn chooses his share first. The following paragraph deals with the opposite case. If the father never acknowledged them, the children of the female servant inherit nothing, but are free to go free. Now, combine that with what Abraham did. Abraham gave the boy the name the angel commanded. Abraham raised the boy as his son for 17 years. Abraham circumcised the boy on the day of the covenant. Abraham asked God that Ishmael might live before him. Public recognition is certainly not lacking in this story. In fact, it's abundantly lacking. What Sarah saw at that party wasn't a cute teenager. It was a legally recognized heir, 17 years old, trained, strong, mocking the name of his 2-year-old brother on the day of the public declaration of succession. And she calculated what would happen on the day Abraham died. The text says that this word seemed very bad in Abraham's eyes because of his son. This sentence deserves a moment of silence. Hebrew is powerful. That hurt him. And the text specifies the reason in no uncertain terms. Because of his son. Not because of Hagar. Because of the boy he raised for 17 years, who learned to walk holding his hand, whom he presented to his allies as the future of that household. Abraham is being forced to choose between 2 sons, and he doesn't want to. That night, God spoke to him. And God's answer is surprising for 2 reasons. The first point is that God does not correct Sarah. God tells Abraham not to be displeased with the boy or the maidservant, and that in everything Sarah says, he should listen to her voice, because it is through Isaac that the offspring will be reckoned. In other words, the legal separation is confirmed from above. The line of the covenant, the line that will lead to the land of Canaan, to the people of Israel, to the law, to the prophets, and to the Messiah, runs through Isaac. This is decided. The second reason is what God says next, without pause, in the same speech. He will make a nation of the son of the slave woman, because he is a descendant of Abraham. Genesis chapter 21, verse 13. The verse that opened this documentary. God is not discarding Ishmael. God is dividing inheritances. Isaac receives the covenant of the land and the messianic promise. Ishmael receives an entire nation and the stated reason for the blessing, because he is a descendant of Abraham. Abraham's blood still has some significance to God even outside the covenant line. At dawn, Abraham gets up. The text describes what he did with a chilling coldness. He took bread. He took a skin of water. He placed it on Hagar's shoulders. And he handed over the boy. Look what's not on this list. No camel, no donkey, no servant to accompany him, no silver, no herd, no letter of recommendation to any neighboring clan chief. Bread and water. A wealthy man, owner of flocks, with 318 trained men born in his household, sends his wife and son away with only bread and water. This is not meanness. This is the legal procedure. In the case of disadoption, what leaves is the bare minimum for subsistence, precisely because leaving with possessions would mean leaving with part of the inheritance. Abraham is following the procedure to the letter, and the procedure is cruel. There is also a strange detail in the Hebrew of this verse. The construction suggests that he also placed the boy on her shoulders. A 17-year-old boy is not carried on his mother's shoulders. The meaning is legal. The boy is transferred to the full custody of his mother. He ceases to be under the father's care. From that moment on, the mother is responsible for him, and the 2 of them walk away. The text says that she wandered aimlessly through the desert of Beersheba. The Hebrew verb there conveys the idea of wandering aimlessly, being lost. Beersheba is the last point of civilization before the south. From there, southwards comes the Negev. And the Negev is unforgiving. It's a limestone desert, a gravel desert, dry valleys, with annual rainfall that in some areas doesn't exceed 100 millimeters for the entire year, concentrated in just a few days. In summer, the temperature easily exceeds 40 degrees. And the worst part isn't the heat. It's the lack of landmarks. Without roads, without tall trees, without significant elevations, the entire horizon looks the same. An experienced Bedouin orients himself by wells, by wadis, by the position of the sun. A woman walking with her child, without a guide, wanders in circles without realizing it, and the water runs out. What follows is one of the most human scenes in the entire Bible. The text says that she laid the boy under one of the bushes, Then she moved away and sat down about a bow shot away, because she told herself that she didn't want to see the boy die. And sitting there, facing him, she raised her voice and wept. A bow shot. A few dozen paces. Close enough to see. Far enough away not to hear the last breath. A mother calculating the exact distance she can bear to endure the death of her own son. And then comes the verse that closes the circle that began in chapter 16. The text says that God heard the boy's voice. It's not the mother's voice. The loud crying is recorded as hers. But what rises and is heard is the voice of the boy from under the bush. Ishmael. Yishmael. God listens. The name God gave him before he was born is fulfilled again, 17 years later, on the worst day of his life. The angel of God calls to Hagar from heaven and calls her by name again. He asks her what is wrong. He tells her not to be afraid, because God has heard the boy's voice from where he is. He tells her to get up, lift the boy up, and take him by the hand, because God will make him into a great nation. And then something happens that needs to be read carefully, because many people misinterpret it. The text says that God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. It doesn't say that God created a well. It says that God opened her eyes. The well was already there. It existed before she sat down to watch her son die. She just wasn't seeing it. Anyone familiar with the Negev knows this is literal. Desert wells in that region are almost never round holes with visible stone walls. Many are cisterns carved into the rock and covered with stone or hide to prevent the water from evaporating and to keep other people's livestock from using it. You could pass by 20 paces and not notice. Some are wadi wells, dug into the sandy bed of a dry valley, where the water runs beneath the surface. She fills the wineskin. She gives the boy a drink, and they both live. And the chapter ends with a short sentence that defines the next 120 years of his life. The text says that God was with the young man, and he grew up and lived in the desert and became an archer. God was with the young man. This expression is not merely decorative. In the book of Genesis, it is used at specific moments and always with the same weight. It is the expression used about Joseph in Potiphar's house and in the Egyptian prison. It is the expression the Philistines use about Isaac when they make a covenant with him. It is the formula for God's active and protective presence over someone. The narrator could have written that the boy survived. He wrote that God was with him, and this is said about someone who has just been legally separated from the house of Abraham. The presence of God did not leave with the bread and the wineskin. It remained. The text further adds that he lived in the Desert of Paran, and that his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Two pieces of information, and both of them tell us a lot. Let's start with the location. Where is Paran? Paran is not a poetic name. It is a region with a name, a location, and a historical record. It appears several times in the Old Testament. It is through Paran that Israel passes after leaving Sinai. It is from Kadesh Barnea, in the Desert of Paran, that the 12 spies set out to reconnoiter Canaan in the Book of Numbers. It is in Paran that David hides after the death of Samuel in 1 Samuel. It is from Paran that the prophet Habakkuk says that God came, associating the place with the divine manifestation at Sinai. In terms of modern maps, researchers locate the Paran Desert in the central and eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula, extending northeastward toward the Negev and the northwestern border of Arabia. One of the large valleys in this region still bears the name today. Wadi Feiran in Sinai is widely identified with ancient Paran. There is an oasis there, with palm trees fed by a water table in the valley floor, surrounded by granite mountains. Outside the oasis, what exists is a limestone plateau, gravel fields, strips of dunes, and a network of wadis. A wadi is a dry valley. It remains dry year-round, and when the heavy winter rains fall, it turns into a river in minutes, flows violently for a few hours, and dries up again. The water disappears into the sand and continues to move underneath. Those who know where to dig find it. Those who don't die on top of the water. If you were to open a satellite image of this area today, what appears is a beige and brown surface streaked with light veins, as if someone had scratched the ground with a knife. Those streaks are the wadis. There are no cities. There are no planted fields, apart from a few modern irrigated patches. And there are still Bedouins living in this region with the same mobile lifestyle, with tents, goats, and camels. That's where that boy grew up. Now, the route. The geography of this story forms a straight line on the map, and that line explains a lot. Abraham lived in the region of Hebron, in the Judean mountains, at an altitude of almost 1,000 meters, in a place of olive trees, vineyards, and pasture. Descending to the south, the terrain opens up and dries out. The last city in the line is Beersheba, the gate of the Negev. Beersheba has this name precisely because of a well and an oath made there by Abraham with Abimelech, a few verses before this episode. From Beersheba downwards, the city's law ends. There is no authority, no court, no fixed market. There is no nomadic well, and there is a route. When Abraham sends Hagar away, he sends her south, and she ends up in the region through which the road to Shur passes, the same road she had taken 17 years earlier when she fled while pregnant. It is the road that connects Canaan to Egypt, the road of armies, caravans, and the trade of incense, myrrh, copper, and tin. She knows that ground. She's walked there before, and yet she still gets lost, because getting lost there is normal. But this time, she's not coming back. After the well, she does not return to Abraham's tent. She goes to Paran. And this choice is intelligent for two reasons. First, Paran is far enough from Canaan that there would be no dispute over pasture, wells, or land with Isaac's household. In nomadic culture, a well is a cause for war. Isaac himself will fight over wells later. In Genesis chapter 26, placing an entire desert between the two brothers avoids a generation of conflict. Second, Paran is close enough to Egypt to maintain her connection, and that is precisely what the text records next, when it says that she took a wife from the land of Egypt for her son. Notice, she doesn't seek a Canaanite woman. Abraham later makes his servant swear that he wouldn't take a Canaanite wife for Isaac. Hagar achieves the same result by a different route, seeking one from her own side. The marriage is arranged by the mother, not the father, which confirms once again the change of custody. Ishmael comes to belong, legally and culturally, to the maternal line. He is Abraham's son by blood and Egyptian by upbringing and marriage. He is caught between two worlds, the Semitic world of his father's tent and the Nile world of his mother. And the region where he lives is precisely the physical bridge between these two worlds. The third piece of information from the verse is missing. He became an archer. The Hebrew word is roveh kashat, which roughly means the one who shoots, archer, man of the bow. In the ancient world, the bow was an elite weapon. It was not a peasant's tool. The Egyptian army relied on archers, including mounted archers in war chariots. The Hyksos, who dominated northern Egypt for over a century, came in with war chariots and composite bows, a weapon made of layers of glued wood, horn, and sinew, which required technique to manufacture, time to cure, and long training to use. Assyrians, Elamites, Nubians, all the great armies of the region had corps of archers. And hunting with a bow in the desert is another level of difficulty. Paran's game consists of ibex, gazelle, hare, and partridge. Ibex climb vertical rocks. Gazelles dart at over 70 kilometers per hour and can smell the hunter from afar. There's no such thing as shooting haphazardly. It's about knowing the wind, knowing the animal's trail to the water, waiting for hours without moving in the heat, and hitting the target on the first try, because there won't be a second. A man who supports an entire clan in the Paran desert with a bow is no weekend hunter. He is a survival professional and, if necessary, a warrior. In the desert, whoever has reach rules, and that's where the prophecy of chapter 16 fits in. The onager, the pere, is the animal that lives where agriculture doesn't reach. Isaac will be the man of the well, of the flock, of the promised land, of the fixed place. Ishmael will be the man of movement, of hunting, of the bow, of the open horizon. Two brothers, two completely different survival techniques, each trained exactly for the land they received. There is also a strategic consequence of this location that most people don't realize, and which explains what happened to his descendants for over 1,000 years. Whoever controls the region of Paran and northwestern Arabia controls passage. Two major trade routes of the ancient world cross through there. The first is the incense route, which ascended from southern Arabia, in the region that is now Yemen and Oman, carrying incense and myrrh, and crossed the desert through a chain of oases until reaching Petra, and from there continuing to Gaza on the Mediterranean. It was a journey of thousands of kilometers, made by camel, in stages, with mandatory stops at water points. Whoever controlled the water points charged. The second is the route of copper and turquoise from Sinai, mined by the Egyptians from very early on in places like Serabit el-Qadim. Those who live in the desert between Egypt and Arabia, with camels, knowledge of wells, and a bow, do not become poor. They become indispensable. And that's exactly what this young man's children will do. They will become guides, transporters, fare collectors, and, in some cases, kings of cities carved into the rock. But between the verse that says he lived in Paran and the verse that lists the 12 princes, the biblical text jumps over 100 years without mentioning almost anything. Almost nothing. Because there is one scene, a single scene, that cuts through this entire silence. And it takes place at a tomb, with two elderly brothers standing side by side, without a word uttered between them. The biblical text is economical in a way that is sometimes unsettling. It says that the boy grew up in the desert, became an archer, married an Egyptian woman, and then jumps straight to a list of names in Genesis chapter 25. More than 100 years passed between one thing and another. 100 years of a man's life summarized in silence. But this silence did not remain empty in Jewish memory. Two sources outside the Bible filled this gap, and it is worthwhile to know both, understanding exactly the weight that each one carries. Before we move on, we need to agree on something about sources, because from here on out, two books that are not in your Bible will appear. There is what we call a canon. The canon is the list of books recognized as Scripture. For the Hebrew Old Testament, this list has 39 books in the Christian count. It was established over centuries and was basically consolidated in first-century Judaism. Outside of that list, there is an entire library of ancient Jewish material. There are historical books, commentaries, and oral traditions put into writing much later. None of it is scripture, but it's not rubbish either. It is a testament to how the ancient Jews understood their own sacred text, and sometimes It is a historical record of real value. The first of these books to appear is the Book of Jasher, in Hebrew, Sefer HaYashar, the Book of the Just. It is cited twice within the Bible itself, in Joshua chapter 10 and in 2 Samuel chapter 1. That is, a document with this name existed in antiquity, which the biblical authors knew. The problem is that the version circulating today with this title is a medieval compilation of Jewish traditions, and it cannot be proven to be the same book cited in Joshua. Therefore, it serves as a window into Jewish tradition, and not as historical proof. The second is Flavius Josephus. This is a different case. Josephus was a Jewish priest and general from the 1st century AD who fought in the war against Rome, was captured, and ended up writing in Rome the history of his own people for a Roman audience. His work, Jewish Antiquities, is one of the most widely used sources by historians of the ancient world to this day. Josephus has biases, exaggerations, and political interests, but he is a true historian, writing close enough to the facts he describes to be worth a great deal. The rule that will apply from now until the end is simple. What is in Genesis is the text. What comes from Jasher and Josephus is included as a complement, marked, and is never used to contradict the text. When these books say something that Genesis doesn't say, I'll let you know. When they say something that Genesis contradicts, we stick with Genesis. With all that combined, it's possible to delve into those lost years. Chapter 21 of the Book of Jasher is entirely dedicated to this period, and the story it tells is as follows. According to Jasher, after the expulsion, Abraham could not stay away from his son. After some time, he asked Sarah for permission to go see the boy, promised that he would not dismount from the camel and that he would not enter his house, and set off for the Desert of Paran. On the first visit, his son was not there. He had gone hunting, as he did every day. The one who was in the tent was his wife, the Egyptian woman his mother had chosen. Abraham arrived as an old traveler, without identifying himself, and asked for some bread and water, saying that he had come from a long journey. The woman answered harshly. She said she had no bread, no water, and sent the old man away without offering him anything. She didn't even ask where he came from. Abraham then gave her a message. He asked her to tell her husband, when he returned, that an old man from Canaan had passed by and had said that the tent peg of his tent was no good, and that he should replace it with a better one. When the young man returned from the hunt, the woman told him about the old man and repeated the message, and he understood immediately. It was a message from his father. The tent peg was the woman. According to Jasher, he sent that wife back to her relative's house, and the mother went to Egypt and brought another, named Fatima, in some versions of the text. After some time had passed, Abraham again asked Sarah for permission and returned to Paran under the same conditions, and once again his son was hunting. It was his second wife who appeared. This time, the answer was different. The woman made the old man stop, insisted he get off the camel, brought him bread, brought him water, took care of him, and even asked him who he was and where he was going. Abraham ate, and before leaving, he raised his hands and blessed that house. And he left another message, that she should tell her husband that the tent peg was now good, and that he should keep it and not exchange it for anything. When the son returned and heard the message, Jasher says that he knew it was his father, and that he knew his father still had mercy on him, and that from then on he began to take his family to visit Abraham from time to time. This is tradition, not the Bible. There is no verse in Genesis describing these visits. But this tradition attempts to answer a question that the biblical text leaves open, and that any attentive reader asks, did a man who wept at being forced to send his son away simply forget that son for the rest of his life? And there is a detail in Genesis itself that points in the opposite direction from forgetting. A small detail hidden in a burial scene. Abraham dies in Genesis chapter 25 at the age of 175. The text says that he died in a good old age, old and satisfied, and was gathered to his people. And the following verse records who buried the body. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, which is opposite Mamre, the field that Abraham had bought from the sons of Heth. There Abraham and Sarah, his wife, were buried. They're both there. Think about what this means in practical terms. A burial in an ancient tribal culture is not an impromptu event. Someone needed to give notice. Someone needed to know where the brother lived, in which part of the desert, with which clan, and send a messenger after him. And that messenger needed to travel hundreds of kilometers across the desert and return with the man in time for the burial, which in that culture happened quickly because of the climate. In other words, the family knew exactly where to find the expelled son. Contact was never completely broken. And there's the order of the names. The text says Isaac and Ishmael. It doesn't say Ishmael and Isaac, which would be the order by age. The narrator places the son of the covenant first, respecting the timeline of the promise, but places the other one there, alongside, in the same verb, in the same action. No words from either of them are recorded. No inheritance dispute appears. No accusations. No tearful reconciliation scene either. The text simply states that the two buried their father. At that moment, Isaac was 75 years old. His brother was 89. They were two old men, heads of households, with sons and grandsons, standing at the entrance of a cave, bought with money by their father, almost 70 years after the day of the feast, the bread and the skin of water. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Flavius Josephus comments on this same story and adds the interpretation that the Jews of the first century made of all this. In Book 1 of Jewish Antiquities, he recounts the expulsion, the well in the desert, and then jumps to the final outcome. He records that the young man grew up, married an Egyptian woman brought by his mother, and had 12 sons. He says that these sons became heads of nations who occupied the region from the Euphrates River to the Red Sea, and that they called this land Nabatene. Josephus is writing for Roman readers, using names that first-century Romans would recognize. Nabatene is the Nabatean kingdom. It is Petra. It is that city carved into a wall of pink sandstone in southern present-day Jordan, with temple facades cut into the living rock, excavated cisterns, and water channels that cut through gorges. And Josephus does one more thing. He directly links this lineage to the Arabs of his time. For him, the Arabs known to the Romans, who dominated the caravan routes of Arabia and Syria, were descendants of that archer from Paran. He even records the Arab custom of circumcising boys at the age of 13, and explains this by saying that it was the age at which their ancestor was circumcised. And this matches exactly with Genesis chapter 17, where the text states that the boy was 13 years old when he was circumcised, a custom that has endured for centuries, recorded by a first-century historian pointing to a verse written long before him. Now, regarding the bow, there's a technical element that often goes unnoticed, but it helps to understand how a desert family becomes a commercial powerhouse. The Negev Desert and northern Arabia only become fully habitable and passable with one specific animal, the camel, more precisely, the one-humped dromedary. A laden dromedary travels long distances with very little water, eats thorny bushes that no other herd will use, and crosses sand where donkeys and oxen sink. The debate about exactly when the camel was domesticated on a large scale is long-standing among researchers, and some argue for dates much later than the time of the patriarchs. What is not in dispute is the effect. The moment the dromedary came into heavy use in caravans, the desert tribes ceased to be isolated people on the fringes and became the masters of the road. They knew the water holes. They knew how to read the wind and the horizon. They had the animal, and they had the bow to protect the cargo. Those who want to transport incense from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean depend on them. There's no simpler way to put it. That family received the worst land on the map, and a few generations later, that land became the toll booth of the ancient world. Genesis records the result of this in a short passage, in the same 25th chapter, right after Abraham's burial. And here it's worth understanding something about how the book of Genesis is structured, because the structure itself is already a statement. Genesis is organized by a formula that is repeated 10 times throughout the book. In Hebrew, it is the word toledot, which is usually translated as generations, or descendants, or family history. Each time this word appears, a new section begins. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Shem, and so on. And the pattern of the book is always the same. When two branches of the family separate, the narrator first closes the branch that will not continue in the main story, gives it its own section, lists the names respectfully, and only then returns to the chosen branch. It was like that with Cain before Seth. It was like that with Japheth and Ham before Shem. And it will be like that with Esau before Jacob. The son of the servant girl receives his inheritance. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's servant girl, bore to Abraham. Notice that the narrator makes a point of repeating the maternal origin without hiding anything, and he makes a point, in the same sentence, of calling that man a son of Abraham. Then comes the list. 12 names in order of birth, exactly as God had announced in Genesis chapter 17, almost a century earlier. The firstborn is Nebaioth, then Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. Each of these names will become a tribe, and most of them can be located on the map with the help of Assyrian texts, ancient Arabic inscriptions, and archaeological excavations. We will go through them name by name. Nebaioth, in Hebrew, Nebaioth, the firstborn. It is the name most closely tied to later history, because researchers have long associated this name with the Nabateans, the people of Petra. The association is debated due to phonetic differences between the languages, but there is an independent piece of data that reinforces it. Assyrian inscriptions from the 7th century BC mention a tribe from northern Arabia with a very similar name, linked to Kedar in military campaigns. And the prophet Isaiah places the two side by side in chapter 60, when he says that all the flocks of Kedar will be gathered together, and that the rams of Nebaioth will serve. Isaiah is describing tribes rich in flocks from the east and south of Israel, bringing offerings to Jerusalem. Centuries later, the Nabatean kingdom controlled the incense route from Arabia to Gaza, collected caravan taxes, built Petra, constructed Hagar in northwestern Saudi Arabia, and developed a desert water harvesting system that still impresses engineers today. They cut channels into the rock to carry winter rain to sealed cisterns, and kept these cisterns hidden, known only to them. An enemy army that entered their territory would die of thirst over the stored water. That animal from chapter 16, the wild ass that lives where no one lives, has descendants who made it into a system of national defense. Kedar, in Hebrew, Kedar. This is the most frequently mentioned tribe in the entire Bible after the original list. The name is linked to the idea of darkness, and tradition associates this with the black goat hair tents used by the Bedouins, which continue to be used today for the same reason. Black goat hair shrinks when wet and seals out the rain, and when it dries, the weave opens up and lets air through. Psalm 120 speaks of someone lamenting dwelling among the tents of Kedar. The Song of Songs uses these tents as a comparison of beauty. Isaiah has an entire oracle about Kedar and says that the remaining number of archers, the valiant sons of Kedar, will be diminished. Archers. The sons of the archer continued to be archers for over 1,000 years, and the prophet recorded this. Jeremiah, in chapter 49, describes Nebuchadnezzar's campaign against Kedar and speaks of a people who live without gates or bars, who dwell alone, whose possessions are tents, flocks, curtains, and camels. It is a description of a mobile life, without a walled city, exactly the profile announced earlier. And the Assyrians confirm this. Records from kings like Ashurbanipal speak of campaigns against the Kedrains, of captured Kedrain kings, and even mention Arab queens ruling these confederations, which is an interesting detail about the social structure of that people. The location is the Syrian-Arabian desert, between Syria, northern Saudi Arabia, and the border with Mesopotamia. Ad-Baal, in Hebrew Ad-Baal, less well known, but with external records. Assyrian inscriptions from the 8th century BC, from the time of Tiglath-Pileser III, mention an Arab tribe with an equivalent name, which was displaced by the empire to guard the border with Egypt. That is, a clan descended from that family appears in an imperial document as a border force. Approximate region, northwestern Arabia towards Sinai. Mibsam and Mishma appear together in the list and remain together in biblical memory. The names have meanings linked to perfume, in the first case, and to listening in the second. And here a curious detail appears. In 1 Chronicles chapter 4, in the genealogy of the tribe of Simeon, the names Mishma and Mibsam appear again. Simeon received territory within southern Judah, in the Negev, precisely in the area of contact with the desert. Some researchers interpret this as a sign that there was absorption of Ishmaelite clans within Israel, people from the desert who entered the southern tribe through marriage and alliance. If this interpretation is correct, the blood of that archer runs within Israel. Duma is one of the best documented cases. The name appears in Assyrian texts as Adumatu, and it is identified with the large oasis of Dumat al-Jandal in northern Saudi Arabia, in the Al-Jawf region. It is not a village, it is a huge oasis, with palm trees, a fountain, a stone castle called Marid, and an ancient mosque with a minaret that still stands today, in addition to ruins from various layers of occupation. Dumat al-Jandal was a mandatory stop for anyone crossing from northern Arabia towards Mesopotamia. It was the kind of place that determined who would arrive alive on the other side. The Assyrians treated this oasis as a religious and political center for the northern Arabs, and there are records of campaigns to capture the city and take its idols. Isaiah has a short oracle about Duma in chapter 21, with a scene that has become famous. Someone cries out from Seir, asking the watchman how much night is left. And the watchman replies that morning is coming, and also night. It is one of the most enigmatic oracles in the book, and it is directed to a real place with visible ruins. Massa appears in Assyrian lists as a tribe from northern Arabia that paid tribute in camels, and there's an interesting connection within the Bible itself. Chapter 31 of Proverbs opens with the words of King Lemuel, and the Hebrew expression that follows can be read as a place name, indicating that Lemuel was king of Massa. If this reading is correct, the most widely read chapter in the world about the virtuous woman was taught to an Arab king by his mother. Chapter 30 of Proverbs, with the words of Agur, contains the same expression. Two chapters of biblical wisdom possibly set in the Ishmaelite desert. Hadad, sometimes spelled Hadar, The name is linked to a storm deity worshipped throughout the Semitic region and also appears among the kings of Edom. The tribe is located further west, in the area bordering Edom, south of the Dead Sea. Tema is another important name. It's the Tema Oasis in northwestern Saudi Arabia, and it's one of the most impressive sites on the entire peninsula. Tema has an ancient wall, a monumental well known as the Haddaj Well, tens of meters in diameter, and inscriptions in several ancient languages. And there's a historical episode that directly links this place to the Bible. Nabonidus, the last king of the Babylonian Empire, during the same period as the Book of Daniel, abandoned Babylon and went to live in Tema for about 10 years, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in his place. This is recorded in Babylonian inscriptions and is accepted by historians. And it also explains a detail in the Book of Daniel. When Belshazzar offers Daniel the third position in the kingdom, and not the second, it's because the second position was already his, since the first belonged to his absent father. A king of Babylon went to live for a decade in an oasis that bears the name of one of the 12 sons of that archer. The Book of Job mentions the caravans of Tema, searching for water. Isaiah asks the inhabitants of the land of Tema to go out with water to meet the thirsty, those fleeing from war. In biblical literature, Tema is synonymous with water in the middle of nowhere. Jetur, in Hebrew Yetur, is the origin of the Itureans. This tribe migrated north and settled in the region of Lebanon and the anti-Lebanon mountains in southern Syria and northern Israel. In the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke opens chapter 3 by placing the ministry of John the Baptist during the time when Philip was tetrarch of Iturea and the region of Trachonitis. That is, the name of a son of that man from Paran appears as the name of a province on the political map of Jesus' time. The Itureans became known among the Greeks and Romans as elite archers and served as auxiliary troops in Roman armies. Naphish appears alongside Jetur in biblical mentions. 1 Chronicles chapter 5 records a direct confrontation. The Israelite tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, east of the Jordan, waged war against Jetur, Naphish, and Nodab. The text says they won because they cried out to God in battle and trusted in Him, and that they took from them 50,000 camels, 250,000 sheep, 2,000 donkeys, and 100,000 people. Look at the numbers: 50,000 camels in a single plundering operation. That's an entire economy based on desert transport, and it confirms that there were indeed periods of open conflict between the descendants of the two brothers. Kedema closes the list, and the name literally means to the east, those from the east. It is the easternmost tribe in the direction of the interior desert of Arabia, and the expression sons of the east appears several times in the Bible, in the Book of Judges, in Job, in Jeremiah, always referring to the desert peoples east of Canaan, famous for their wisdom and flocks. Once the list is complete, the text delivers its verdict. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names according to their villages and their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. The Hebrew word for princes there is Nesiim, which indicates a high chief, a leader of a confederation, the equivalent of what would later be called a sheikh. And the mention of villages and encampments in the same sentence accurately describes the way of life of that people. One part settled in an oasis with stone constructions, and another part on the move with tents and herds, the two parts linked by the same tribe. That's exactly what archaeology in northern Arabia shows to this day. And verse 18 gives the coordinates of the territory. They dwelt from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt, going toward Assyria. Havilah is a region associated with the south and center of the Arabian Peninsula, linked in ancient lists to gold and precious stones. Sur is the desert strip bordering Egypt. the same path where a pregnant woman was found by an angel many years before. And the direction of Assyria points northeast, towards Mesopotamia. Connect the 3 points, and you can draw the entire Arabian Peninsula, plus the corridor that goes up to Syria and Mesopotamia. The boy who left home with bread and a skin of water had descendants scattered across approximately 3 million square kilometers of desert. And the final phrase of this verse is the most direct echo of everything that was promised. The text says that he established himself before the face of all his brothers. This expression had already appeared in Genesis chapter 16, in the angel's prophecy at the spring. Now it returns at the end of man's life as a confirmation. There is an interesting technical discussion at this point. The Hebrew verb used here, in the form in which it appears, has the basic meaning of falling. Some translations resolve it with fell before, understanding it as conflict or death in confrontation. Others resolve it with dwelt or settled, because this verb is also used for camping, for settling on a territory. The second reading fits better with the context, which is describing territory, and matches the parallel in chapter 16, which speaks of dwelling. A man who settles in front of his brothers and never leaves. The last detail about him comes before that verse, in verse 17. These are the years of Ishmael's life, 137 years. And he breathed his last, died, and was gathered to his people. Pay attention to this formula, because it's not used with just anyone in the book of Genesis. Being gathered to his people is the same expression applied to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's an expression that suggests some continuity after death, a gathering with those who came before. The Genesis texts use this for the patriarchs of the covenant, and they use it for him. The narrator had many ways to end that man's life. He could simply say that he died. He chose the formula of his parents, and the Ishmaelites continue to appear in the Bible after that, always on the fringes of Israel's history, always linked to caravans and the desert. In Genesis chapter 37, when Joseph's brothers decide to get rid of him, a caravan of Ishmaelites is passing by at that exact moment, coming from Gilead, with camels laden with spices, balm, and myrrh, heading down to Egypt. Joseph is sold for 20 pieces of silver to descendants of his grandfather's brother. And it is these men who take the young man into Egypt, where the entire story of that family's salvation will unfold. The desert caravan that traverses Israel's history at its most decisive moment is Ishmaelite. In the Book of Judges, chapter 8, after Gideon's victory, the text calls for the plunder of the defeated enemy's gold earrings and explains in parentheses that they wore gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. It's an ethnographic detail thrown into the middle of the narrative, showing that the author expected the reader to recognize that people by their own custom. In the second book of Samuel, chapter 17, a man named Jethro, or Jether, appears, described as an Israelite in one passage and as an Ishmaelite in 1 Chronicles. He is the father of Amasa, who became an army commander, and Amasa's mother was David's sister, or half-sister. In other words, there was a marriage between David's family and an Ishmaelite, and the son of that marriage became a general. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 27, in the list of administrators of King David's possessions, there appears a man named Obal, the Ishmaelite, in charge of the king's camels. That makes perfect sense. Who else would you put in charge of your camel herd, if not a commoner who has been riding camels for 1,000 years? Psalm 83 places them on the other side, in a list of peoples allied against Israel, alongside Edom, Moab, Ammon, and the Hagarenes, the latter name linked to Hagar. Alliance and conflict, marriage and war, trade and dispute. For centuries, The descendants of the two brothers lived exactly as the angel had foretold at the desert spring, side by side, within sight of each other, without either of them disappearing from the map. And it is this entire story that the Apostle Paul will use, almost 2,000 years later, to explain the gospel to a group of churches in the region of Galatia, in present-day Turkey. The text is in Galatians chapter 4, verses 22 to 31. And to understand what Paul is doing there, it is necessary to know what he is writing against. After Paul founded those churches with non-Jewish people, other teachers arrived saying that faith in Jesus was the beginning, but that something was missing. They lacked circumcision. They lacked observing the days. They lacked embracing the law of Moses. Without these things, they said, those Christians would not truly be part of God's people. Paul writes the harshest letter in the New Testament against this idea. And in the middle of it, he appeals to the story of Abraham. He begins by recalling the fact. Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and one by the free woman. Then it highlights the difference in how each one came into the world. The son of the slave woman was born according to the flesh. The son of the free woman was born through the promise. According to the flesh, in Paul's vocabulary, this means through what a human being can produce with their own resources. Sarah was barren, the clock was ticking, and the solution came from a perfectly legal and perfectly human arrangement. It worked biologically. A real child was born. Through the promise, he means the opposite. A 90-year-old body that had already stopped functioning, a 100-year-old husband, and a son who only exists because God spoke. And then Paul says that it has a second meaning, and he makes the comparison. He says that the two women represent two alliances. One of them comes from Mount Sinai and bears children for slavery, and that is Hagar. And he adds a geographical detail that only makes sense after everything we've seen. He says that Sinai is a mountain in Arabia. In other words, Paul is using a map. The law was given on a mountain located precisely in the desert region where that family settled. And he connects this Sinai covenant to the Jerusalem of that time, the Jerusalem of the temple, and the religious system that was persecuting Christians, saying that it is in bondage along with its children. On the other side, he places the Jerusalem above, which is free, and which is the mother of those who believe. And he quotes the prophet Isaiah in chapter 54, that text which commands the barren woman to sing and rejoice, because the children of the desolate woman will be more numerous than those of the woman who has a husband. The argument concludes as follows. Whoever tries to reach God through their own effort, by following rules, by acknowledging merit, is in the position of the slave's child. They are born a slave because their mother is a slave. The legal status comes with birth, and no one can change their own condition from within the system that created it. Those born of the promise are born free, because freedom is not earned. It is the mother's condition. And here it's necessary to state one thing clearly, because this passage has been twisted in every way imaginable throughout history. Paul is not talking about ethnicity. He is not saying that Arabs are slaves and Jews are free. He is saying the opposite, and in a way that was shocking to the Jewish readers of the time. He places the religious Jerusalem of his time on the side of the slave, and places the Gentile Christians of Galatia, people who had no Abrahamic blood at all, on the side of the free son. The comparison is not about the people. It's about method, about human effort versus divine promise. And Paul himself concludes the argument by quoting the harshest phrase in history, Sarah's command, "Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman." He is telling the Galatians to expel from their lives the system of trying to be accepted by God through performance. Do not live with that. Do not let that dwell in the same tent as grace. because the two do not share an inheritance. And there is a subtle detail that ties Paul to the Hebrew of Genesis. When he describes what the older son did to the younger, he uses the verb to persecute. He is interpreting that difficult word from the day of the banquet, that metzahek, and reading it as hostility. In other words, even in the 1st century, a learned Jew, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, read that verse as hostile mockery and not as an innocent joke. But notice what Paul does not do. He does not negate Genesis chapter 21, verse 13. He does not say that God abandoned the servant's son. He does not treat his descendants as reprobate. He uses a scene from history to illustrate two ways of trying to relate to God. This is a theological argument, not a judgment on a people. And the most unsettling part of this text is this. If the comparison is about method, then most of us have, at some point, lived on the wrong side of the tent. Have you ever tried to earn something from God? Everyone's been there. It's almost automatic. The week was good. You prayed more, resisted something that usually sets you back, treated well those who didn't deserve it. And on Sunday, you stand before God with the attitude of someone who has earned it. And then comes the bad week. You fail miserably, and you can't even pray properly because it feels like you're in debt. This is the slave system at work within you. It's the same reasoning as Genesis chapter 16, only updated. God promised, but it's taking too long, and we find a way to solve it ourselves. And here are 3 things from that story that will directly affect your life today, without any beating around the bush. First, the plan you devise to accelerate the promise will generate consequences that you will carry for decades, and yet God will not abandon you within it. Sarah and Abraham did something good, acceptable, intelligent, and it brought tension to that house for the rest of their lives. But God didn't disappear. He continued speaking, continued fulfilling, and even cared for the people affected by the shortcut. If you made such a decision in a marriage, in a business, in a debt, in a relationship, the damage is real, and you will manage it. And God remains in the midst of it with you. Both things are true at the same time. Secondly, there are people in your life today occupying Hagar's place, and you probably haven't realized it. The person who serves you and is treated as if they were invisible. The person who works in your house. The person who delivers your food. The relative who has become a burden on the family and whom everyone talks about behind their back. The whole story revolves around a God who stops everything to talk to the Egyptian servant in the middle of nowhere, calls her by name, and hears the cries of a teenager under a bush. The God of the Bible listens to those who have been discarded. If you are the owner of the tent in your story, look at who is on the edge of it this week. Learn their name. Start there. The third, God opened her eyes to a well that was already there. No rain fell from the sky. No water gushed from the rock. The provision was just a few steps away, and she wasn't seeing it because she was sitting facing the worst possible scenario, waiting for it to happen. You might be doing that right now, sitting a stone's throw from your own problem, determined to watch everything collapse, with an exit right beside you that you can't see because fear has narrowed your vision. Before asking for a new miracle, it's worth asking for eyes to see what has already been placed near you. And here's a question for you to answer on your own, without an audience. Which of the two do you truly trust when things get tough? The promise God made or the backup plan you put together? Because it's possible to say you trust the promise with your mouth and live entirely within the plan. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Romans chapter 8, verse 32. If that's God's logic, then the shortcut was never necessary. Going back to the beginning of it all. The story opened with a verse that almost no one preaches, Genesis chapter 21, verse 13, where God says that he would also make a nation of the son of the servant, because he was a descendant of Abraham. 90 minutes later, you can see that verse fulfilled with a name, a map, and a date. 12 princes, exactly the number announced. A territory stretching from Havilah to Shur, toward Assyria, covering the Arabian Peninsula from end to end. Tribes that appear in Assyrian inscriptions, in the oracles of Isaiah and Jeremiah, in Proverbs of Kings, in the ruins of oases that are still standing. A people who became known for their bow and who continued to be called archers by the prophets 1,000 years after their father learned to shoot in the Desert of Paran. And a final scene that sums it all up. 2 elderly brothers, separated in adolescence by a legal decision, burying the same father in the same cave, without a single recorded word of fighting. God separated the inheritances. Isaac received the covenant of the land, the line of the Messiah, the people who would carry on the law and the prophets. The other received freedom, the desert, the bow, and countless descendants. A different heritage is not a rejection. And that man's name remains the most impressive thing in the whole story, because it is a complete phrase. Ishmael. God hears. God heard the affliction of an Egyptian servant girl at a spring on the road to Egypt. God heard the voice of a boy lying under a bush in the desert of Beersheba. God heard the plea of a 99-year-old father who only wanted his son to live before him. And if he heard the woman no one else wanted to hear, and the boy who was sent away with only bread and water, there's a good chance he's hearing what you don't have the courage to say out loud. In the next study, we'll go to the other side of the same family. Esau and Jacob, twin brothers, a birthright sold for a bowl of food, and an encounter at the Jabbok River that changed a man's name forever. If you want to see this one, subscribe to the channel, because it comes out soon, and it's not worth missing the rest after you've come this far. One last thing, and this one stays. That boy grew up hearing that he was the last surviving son, and he carried until death a name that said the opposite, that the God of the universe had stopped to listen. Sometimes what your story says about you and what God says about you are two very different things. Keep the second one.